Hello, technical writers. This is the first presentation that you are viewing, and we are going to talk about what technical writing is and what technical writers do in this presentation. So the most basic definition of technical writing is the communication of technical information to lay audiences and alternatively technical audiences. So, as you'll read about for today, technical writers create documents like instruction sets and medical care instructions that are read by the general public who have no scientific background. But they also create documents like grant proposals, client briefs, and lab reports for audiences who do have some scientific background, but just not the same background or as much knowledge as the writer. Within these multiple types of documents, there are three basic work tasks that we like to say technical writers perform. And you'll see each of these tasks throughout the documents we create this semester. First, technical writers are information designers. So what's the difference between information design and simply writing something? And I'll give you a few minutes to look at this wheel here that is showing the multiple formats through which information can be communicated. Here's a good example of the difference between information design and simply writing something. This is the dash of a car. How many of these 64 separate warning lights can you tell the meaning of? Some of them are obvious, but some are impossible to understand without turning to the car's owner's manual. This is an example of bad information design. Ideally and increasingly, this is the case. A dashboard would not only tell the driver what exactly is wrong with the car, but also what to do about that. How many of you have faced a similarly impossible to understand control panel on some technical equipment? Things don't have to be difficult to understand. And when information isn't designed clearly, it can be dangerous. Here is an infographic, and I wanted to give you two different design projects so you could see how one might be more effective than the other and different platforms that designers and technical writers use in order to convey messages. I'll give you a few seconds to review the infographic and contemplate the three questions that I have posed for you here. Okay, so let's move on. Let's think about information that's designed poorly. When information is designed poorly, we often don't trust it. So here's a good example of that. Which of these gas station pumps would you be more likely to trust your credit card information with? For better or worse, we trust good-looking things more than we trust ugly things. A really interesting example of this psychological fact is a 1995 study done by Japanese researchers Kurosu and Kasimura. They created two ATMs, both with the exact same functionality, and made one ugly and one pretty. What pretty means for an ATM, I really don't know. Yet, the designers asked a set of people to use these ATMs, and the overwhelmingly majority felt the ugly ATM worked worse compared to the pretty one. Why? Well, we get less frustrated with pretty things. We're more willing to work through them. So all this to say, there's a reason why I'm asking you to create good-looking texts, from the resumes that you'll create in this first unit to the research proposals that you'll create later in the semester. Think about what good design looks like. The second major work activity of technical writers is user advocacy. How many of you have thought and researched who the users are of your designs in other classes? I ask this question every semester, and almost every student says that they have not contemplated that or considered who uses their design or who uses their report or who uses their research. In this class, in every single assignment, you are going to ask yourself who is using this text and what do they want? And I've posed 5 questions for you to think about here. And I'd like for you to make sure you refer back to these questions anytime you are submitting a major assignment, because these are questions that you should be considering as you work through your designs and your write-ups and your assignments. Designer Donald Norman calls this standard of production user-centered design. A lot of engineers and designers like to think about efficiency, cost, and creativity when they design products, but never ask the user what they want or watch the user attempt to use that design before it goes to market. And if the user fails to use that product successfully, the user is almost always blamed. We call that user error. But as Norman says, most accidents are attributed to human error, but in almost all cases, the human error was the direct result of poor design. Here's some examples of non-user centered designs. On the left of the screen, you'll see some pretty confusing light switches. It would be difficult for a user that's not familiar with these switches or a first-time user to know what button affects the outcome. And if you look at the doors, that's pretty confusing. Actually, you shouldn't have to label doors. And the phone here, you'll see that the buttons for the top half of the phone are not labeled. So someone who did not program this phone or is not familiar with the functions of this form would not know what the buttons actually do. The final duty that technical writers have in the world is that they are stewards of writing in the organizations they work for. That is, they teach other people to communicate well. Something I want to think about right now is who in the past in your science classes taught you how to write. For instance, who taught you to write a lab report? Were they good at teaching that? Were they terrible? Good technical writers are good teachers. One thing a lot of students ask me or really tell me is that they don't need to be good writers because they aren't going to write on the job, and the businesses they work for have good writers already. While this is true, I will also tell them that at the very least they need to make the writers that work for them have an easier time if they know how to deliver good writing to them. Second, although in my case, I'm happy to take people's money for writing for them, the designer should always think about the cost and why they would want to pay someone else to do something that they could do themselves. I mean, some of your professors have paid professional writers to write a grant for them or a research article. In my case, I charge $200 an hour to write these kinds of proposals. So that's money that the designer or the professional is losing out on. And finally, it's been statistically shown that good writers and speakers, people who can explain why the research they are doing is important, get promoted faster and paid more. So now to end on something a little different. Your first lesson in writing, and something I want to really drill into you, is scannability. That is, making your documents scannable. Scannability is one of the most important lessons for technical writers to learn, because in other classes, no one writes scannable things. We just write big blocks of text, but in the real world, no one wants to read big blocks of text. People jump around between sections, read headings, look at pictures, so you need to design for that. To do so, technical writers use what is called the dual path reading. What your goal will be in all the documents you create in this class is to imagine your readers. I'm sorry, to imagine two readers. First, the reader who deeply cares about every minute detail and will read everything. But secondly, and more importantly, you need to imagine a reader like a boss or a client who isn't interested in the details and wants to jump around the text between sections. For that second reader, you use headings, subheadings, bullets, numbered lists, caption, images, short paragraphs, phrases. So, when thinking about scannability, think about these questions when you're creating a document specifically. And as you're creating your resumes, which will be the first document that you'll create in the class, have these questions in mind. So, lastly, if you haven't taken anything away from this lesson, one thing I do want to make sure I emphasize is that I expect the resumes to be scannable. So, if you need to go back to the previous slide and contemplate the questions I've posed in order to make your documents more scannable, I encourage you to do so. Okay, so that is the end for this first presentation. Bye for now.